Mrs. Karen Whitmore stood on her front porch, arms crossed, watching the teenager across the street with suspicion. He wore a red hoodie, hands stuffed into his pockets, and was standing near her neighbor's driveway. He wasn't doing anything, just looking at his phone, but something about him made her uneasy. She had never seen him in the neighborhood before, and in her mind, that was enough reason to act. Reaching for her phone, she dialed 911. "There's a suspicious young man loitering outside my house," she said, lowering her voice as if he could hear her. "I don't know what he's up to, but he looks out of place. Could you send someone to check?" Within minutes, a patrol car arrived. The teenager barely had time to register what was happening before the officers approached him. "Hands out of your pockets," one of them ordered. Confused, he obeyed. "What's going on?" "We got a report about you," the officer replied, scanning him up and down. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" "I'm waiting for my mom," he answered, his voice steady despite the tension. "She lives here," Mrs. Whitmore scoffed. "Oh, really? And which house would that be?" she asked, stepping forward. Before he could respond, a sleek black SUV turned onto the street, rolling to a stop right beside them. The door swung open, and out stepped a tall, commanding woman in a navy blue blazer and high heels. Her presence was immediate, her aura undeniable. "Is there a problem, officers?" she asked, her tone sharp yet controlled. "Ma'am, we received a call about this young man acting suspiciously in the neighborhood," one of the officers explained. Her eyes flickered to Mrs. Whitmore, who shifted uncomfortably. Then she turned to her son. "Omari, are you okay?" "Yes, Mom," he said, relief washing over his face. Mrs. Whitmore's face paled. You're his mother?" The woman raised an eyebrow. "I am, and I also happen to be District Attorney Lillian Carter." She pulled out her badge, flipping it open with practiced ease. "Now, I'd like to know why my son was stopped for standing outside his own home." The officers exchanged glances, suddenly realizing the gravity of the situation. Mrs. Whitmore's mouth opened and closed, her confidence vanishing. "I just thought—" "You thought what?" Lillian cut in. "That a black teenager in a nice neighborhood must be up to no good?" The officers quickly shifted their stance. "Apologies, ma'am. We were just responding to a call." "Next time, respond with reason, not bias," Lillian stated firmly. "Come on, Omari." As mother and son walked towards their house, Mrs. Whitmore stood frozen, left to grapple with the weight of her mistake. As Lillian and Omari stepped onto their porch, Omari turned back for a moment, watching Mrs. Whitmore still standing there, her face drained of color. The officers hesitated before nodding awkwardly and retreating to their patrol car. Omari let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "Mom, do you think she'll ever change?" Lillian sighed, unlocking the door. "People like her don't change overnight, but sometimes a moment like this plants a seed." She glanced over at Mrs. Whitmore, who had started fidgeting with her phone, avoiding eye contact. "She won't forget this, that's for sure." Inside, Omari dropped onto the couch, shaking his head. "It's exhausting, you know? Always having to prove we belong." Lillian sat beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I know, baby. I've been fighting this battle my whole life. That's why I do what I do." Omari nodded but still looked unsettled. What if the next person who calls the cops isn't just some nosy neighbor? What if it's someone worse? Lillian's expression hardened. "Then we fight smarter, stand stronger. You belong here just as much as anyone else. Never forget that." A knock at the door made them both turn. Through the peephole, Lillian saw Mrs. Whitmore shifting uncomfortably on the porch. Omari frowned. "Seriously?" Lillian exhaled and opened the door, arms crossed. "Yes." Mrs. Whitmore swallowed, her voice uncertain. I just wanted to say, I may have overreacted." Omari scoffed. "May have." Lillian held up a hand to calm him. "Go on," she said, though her tone was firm. I've lived in this neighborhood for 20 years, and I guess Mrs. Whitmore stopped, realizing there was no excuse that wouldn't make her look worse. "I'm sorry," she finally said. Lillian studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I appreciate that." Mrs. Whitmore looked at Omari. And I'm sorry to you, too. Omari wasn't sure what to say. He wasn't ready to forgive. Not yet. But he nodded stiffly, accepting the apology for what it was. As Mrs. Whitmore turned to leave, Lillian called after her, "Next time, before calling the cops, try calling your conscience first." The woman flinched slightly, but nodded before walking away. Omari watched her retreat down the steps. "You think she actually learned something?" Lillian sighed. "We'll see." They closed the door, but the moment lingered. A small victory, perhaps, but the fight wasn't over. It never was. That night, Omari sat at the dinner table, still replaying the encounter in his mind. The food in front of him sat untouched as he tapped his fork against a plate, deep in thought. Lillian noticed. "Talk to me," she said gently. Omari exhaled. "It just doesn't feel like enough, Mom." She apologized because she got embarrassed, not because she really understood what she did. Lillian nodded slowly. "Maybe, but change, real change, doesn't happen in a single conversation. It takes time." Omari shook his head. "I just hate that this keeps happening. And not everyone has a DA for a mom to come to their rescue." Lillian gave him a sad smile. "That's why I fight. And that's why you have to decide how you want to respond. You can be angry, rightfully so, but don't let that anger weigh you down. Use it." Omari looked at her. "Use it how?" She leaned back. "By knowing your worth. By standing up for yourself and for others. By making sure people like Mrs. Whitmore don't get to define who you are." Omari thought about that. Then, after a moment, he nodded. "Maybe I should talk to her." Lillian raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" "Not to forgive her," he clarified, "but to make her understand. Or at least try." Lillian smiled. "That's my boy." The next day, Omari walked over to Mrs. Whitmore's house and rang the doorbell. She opened the door hesitantly, clearly surprised to see him standing there. "Omari," she said, "what can I do for you?" He took a breath. "I want to talk." Mrs. Whitmore looked unsure, but stepped aside. "All right." They sat on her porch, an awkward silence between them. Omari finally broke it. "You ever had someone assume the worst about you, just because of how you look?" Mrs. Whitmore frowned. "Well, no." Omari nodded. "I have. My whole life. And yesterday you did it too." She shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't mean—" Omari held up a hand. "I don't care what you meant. I care about what you did. You saw me, and instead of thinking, maybe he lives here, maybe he belongs, you called the police, and that could have gone really bad." Mrs. Whitmore looked down, shame creeping into her features. Omari continued, "I don't need an apology. I need you to be better. Next time, when you see a black kid in your neighborhood, don't assume. Think." She was quiet for a long moment. Then, finally, she nodded. "You're right." Omari stood up. "Good." As he walked away, he didn't know if she would truly change. But at least now, she had no excuse. When he got home, Lillian was waiting at the door, arms crossed. "So," Omari smirked, "let's just say she won't be calling the cops on any more black kids anytime soon." Lillian smiled proudly. "That's my son." And for the first time in a while, Omari felt lighter. The fight wasn't over, but today he had won a battle. And that was enough. Days passed, and life in the neighborhood returned to its usual rhythm. Omari went about his routine, but something felt different. Maybe it was the way Mrs. Whitmore avoided eye contact when he passed her house. Or maybe it was how other neighbors seemed to watch him just a little too closely now, as if whispers had spread about what had happened. One afternoon, as he was walking home from school, he saw Mrs. Whitmore standing in her front yard, struggling with a heavy bag of mulch. He hesitated, then sighed. Whether he liked it or not, he had planted a seed. Maybe it was time to water it. "Need some help?" he asked, walking over. She looked up, startled. "Oh, She glanced at the bag in her hands, then at him. "Yes, that would be nice." Omari grabbed the bag and carried it to the flower bed where she was working. He dropped it gently and dusted off his hands. "You should probably get smaller bags next time. These are too heavy." Mrs. Whitmore chuckled nervously. I suppose you're right. She hesitated before saying, "Thank you." Omari nodded. "No problem." He turned to leave, but she spoke again. "You know, I've been thinking a lot since we talked." Omari stopped. "Yeah." She swallowed, looking down at the dirt she was digging. "I was raised to believe certain things. Not outright hateful things, but assumptions about who belongs where, about who's dangerous and who isn't." She met his gaze. "And I never questioned them until now." Omari folded his arms. "So, what are you going to do about it?" She exhaled. "I don't know yet, but I want to do better." Omari studied her for a moment. He wasn't sure if she was just saying what she thought he wanted to hear. But then again, people didn't change overnight. "Good," he said finally. "Start with your friends. Your neighbors. When they say something that doesn't sit right, call it out." Mrs. Whitmore nodded. "I will." Omari gave her one last look before heading home. When he stepped inside, Lillian was at the dining table, looking up from her work. "How'd that go?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Omari shrugged. "I think she's trying." Lillian nodded approvingly. "That's a start." Omari sat down, picking at the mail on the table. "You think people can really change?" Lillian considered the question. "Some do, some don't. But the ones who do, they need people like you to challenge them." Omari thought about that and, for the first time in days, felt a sense of hope. Maybe change wasn't about big, dramatic moments. Maybe it was about the small ones, the quiet conversations, the moments where people, however reluctantly, started to see the world differently. And maybe, just maybe, he had made that happen out a few weeks past, and the neighborhood felt different. It wasn't anything huge, but Omari noticed subtle shifts. Mrs. Whitmore no longer avoided him. In fact, one afternoon, she waved at him from her porch. It wasn't much, but it was something. The real surprise came later that week when Omari overheard a conversation while walking past a group of neighbors. They were standing on the sidewalk, discussing an upcoming neighborhood meeting. "I just don't feel safe with all these unfamiliar faces around," one man was saying. "We need to do something before the wrong kind of people start moving in." Omari bristled, ready to keep walking, but then he heard a familiar voice. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that leads to problems," Mrs. Whitmore said. Omari stopped, just out of their line of sight. The man frowned. "Karen, you were the one who called the cops last time. Now you're defending." "I was wrong," she interrupted firmly, "and I won't make that mistake again. Maybe instead of assuming the worst, we should get to know our neighbors." The group fell silent. Omari almost couldn't believe what he was hearing. One woman scoffed. "So now we're just supposed to ignore safety concerns?" "No," Mrs. Whitmore said. "We're supposed to think before we act. You call the cops when there's an actual problem, not when a black teenager is standing on the sidewalk." Omari smirked. That was definitely progress. Later that evening, he told his mom about what he had overheard. Lillian smiled, crossing her arms. Well, looks like Mrs. Whitmore is on a redemption arc." Omari laughed. "Yeah, but let's see if she sticks with it." Lillian nodded. "People like her have a choice. They can fall back into old habits, or they can do the work to change. But one thing for sure," she gave Omari a proud look, "she wouldn't have even started thinking about it if it weren't for you." Omari sat back, letting that sink in. Maybe he hadn't just won a battle. Maybe he had started something bigger. As the sun set outside, he realized something. Change wasn't about one conversation or one moment. It was about planting seeds and trusting that, with time, they might just grow. And in the most unexpected place. That's exactly what was happening a few months later. The neighborhood held its annual block party. It was the kind of event where the same familiar faces gathered. Families with kids, retirees tending to their well-manicured lawns, and the usual group of neighbors who treated the street as their private country club. Omari had never cared much for these events, but his mom insisted they go. "Visibility matters," she had said, and as much as he hated to admit it, she was right. As he walked to the party, nodding at a few familiar faces, He noticed Mrs. Whitmore standing with a group of women near the food table. To his surprise, she wasn't just making small talk. She was actively calling people out. "I'm just saying it's different now," one woman was saying. "There are so many new people moving in, and we don't know anything about them." Mrs. Whitmore took a sip of her lemonade. "Well, then maybe you should introduce yourself instead of assuming they don't belong." Omari smirked to himself. It was surreal, watching her correct the same kind of behavior she had once been guilty of. Then, something even stranger happened. She caught his eye across the yard and, without hesitation, walked over to him. "Omari," she greeted a little nervously. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, tilting his head. "Didn't expect to see you defending the newcomers." She exhaled, glancing around. "Neither did I. But I've been thinking a lot since that day. About what you said." Omari folded his arms. And I realize you were right," she admitted. "I used to think racism was just something obvious. Slurs, violence. I never thought about the ways it creeps into everyday decisions. Into fear. Into assumptions." She looked down briefly. "It took embarrassing myself to see it, but I see it now." Omari studied her. She seemed genuine, but he wasn't about to start handing out gold stars. "So what are you going to do about it?" he asked. Mrs. Whitmore smiled slightly. "Well, for starters, I've been volunteering with a local diversity and inclusion group." Omari raised an eyebrow. "You, Karen Whitmore, are in a diversity group?" She chuckled. "I know. If you had told me that 6 months ago, I would have laughed." Omari smirked. "Yeah, me too." A comfortable silence settled between them before she spoke again. "I know I can't erase what happened," she said. "And I don't expect you to forget it. But I want to do better. And I want you to know that you, Omari Carter, are part of the reason I started thinking differently." Omari wasn't sure how to respond to that. He had spent so much time feeling angry, hurt, and exhausted by people like her. But now, seeing someone actually make an effort to change, it was strange. Not bad, just unexpected. "Finally," he shrugged. "I guess that's a start." She smiled. "It is." As she walked back to her group, Omari spotted his mom watching from a distance, arms crossed, a knowing look on her face. "You see that?" Omari called. Lillian smirked. "Oh, I saw it." Omari shook his head. "She's actually trying." Lillian walked up beside him. "Told you, people can change. They just need a reason to." Omari let out a breath, watching the party around him. Maybe change wasn't always about huge moments. Maybe it was about small steps, repeated over time. And maybe, just maybe, he had made more of a difference than he thought. The following weeks were a quiet sort of triumph for Omari. The block party had marked an unexpected turning point. Not just for Mrs. Whitmore, but for the whole neighborhood. Small conversations, once brushed aside, began to grow into something more substantial. He saw Mrs. Whitmore engage with her neighbors in ways she hadn't before, challenging their assumptions when necessary, while also listening when it mattered. It wasn't perfect. There were still awkward moments and old habits die hard, but there was progress. One evening, Omari and Lillian were sitting on the porch, enjoying the cool breeze. Omari was tapping away on his phone when he suddenly looked up. "Mom, remember how we talked about making change, about planting seeds?" Lillian nodded. "I remember." "Why?" Omari hesitated, unsure of how to put it. "I think I get it now." She raised an eyebrow, leaning back in her chair. "Oh, I used to think that change had to be this big, dramatic thing. Like, I'd have to confront people every single time they did something wrong or make them feel horrible for being ignorant," Omari said, looking at his phone screen again. "But now, I don't know. I think it's more about the long game, about showing people a different way, not through conflict, but through patience." Lillian smiled softly, a mix of pride and understanding in her eyes. "That's exactly it. Change doesn't happen all at once. It happens through consistency, through showing up even when it feels like nothing is shifting." Omari nodded thoughtfully. "I'm still angry about a lot of things, Mom. I still feel like I shouldn't have to be the one to teach people about their own biases. Lillian's smile faded a bit, her expression softening with empathy. You shouldn't. But sometimes the people who've been hurt the most are the ones who have the power to change things. I know it's not fair. It's exhausting. But sometimes you'll be the one who has to lead by example. Omari let that sink in. He hadn't fully realized just how much he'd been carrying, how much weight he had silently assumed in order to shift the world around him, even in small ways.